September 27th, 1944. Dawn broke pale and grey over a battered airfield in northern France. The wind carried the low growl of engines and the sharp scent of aviation fuel. On the runway stood a C-47 transport aircraft, its olive paint dulled by mud and smoke. Its cargo, not ammunition or supplies, but something far more fragile, life itself. 5 wounded American soldiers lay strapped to stretchers inside, their bandages stained, their futures uncertain. And standing among them was Lieutenant Reba Whittle, a 24-year-old flight nurse from Rockford, Illinois, whose courage would soon test the limits of humanity itself. Reba had already completed more than 50 missions like this one. Each flight was a race against time, ferrying men from the chaos of the front to the safety of English hospitals. She knew the drill. Check morphine levels, secure 4 lines, monitor breathing, keep them alive, until help was waiting on the other side of the channel. But this morning was different. The original nurse assigned to the mission had fallen ill, and Reba, true to her nature, volunteered to take her place. It was supposed to be a routine 2-hour flight. Yet in war, even routine can turn into tragedy in a heartbeat. She stood by the open hatch, watching mechanics load the last of the stretchers, her breath forming small white clouds in the cold air. Her uniform was already smudged with oil, her hands steady as she adjusted a soldier's oxygen mask. She had been trained to stay calm, to be the steady voice above the storm. "You're going home, boys," she whispered with a reassuring smile. For the wounded, her confidence was medicine. At exactly 0800 hours, the engines roared to life, and the C-47 lifted off the runway, wheels tucking beneath its belly as it climbed into the low September clouds. The world below was a patchwork of broken towns and scarred fields, reminders of the war she had dedicated her life to easing. For the first hour, everything was calm. The hum of engines filled the cabin, punctuated only by the faint groans of pain from her patients. Reba moved from stretcher to stretcher, checking pulses, adjusting bandages, whispering words of comfort that barely rose above the drone of the propellers. Then, without warning, Captain Charles Lay's voice crackled over the intercom, sharp, urgent, and unlike anything she had heard before. "Bandits at 2 o'clock high!" Reba froze. German Focke-Wulf 192nds, sleek and deadly, were diving from the clouds. The C-47 was unarmed, a flying ambulance, but mercy held no protection in the sky that day. Bullets ripped through the fuselage, sparks lighting the dim interior. The aircraft shuddered violently, metal shrieking as holes tore through the thin aluminum skin. Reba grabbed a handhold, struggling to stay upright as the plane banked hard. Medical kits and bottles flew from their racks. One of the wounded cried out in terror. "Hold on," she shouted, covering a soldier's body with her own as debris rained down. Through a small window she glimpsed smoke pouring from the left engine. The plane lurched again, alarms screaming. The co-pilot's voice came over the intercom. Right engines hit too, followed by static. For 3 eternal minutes, the C-47 fought to stay in the air. The pilots tried to climb, to turn, to find a clearing, but the engines were dying. Then came the final command from the cockpit. "Brace for crash landing." Reba's hands trembled as she braced herself over her patients. She could see the ground rushing closer through a bullet-shattered window. Brown earth, broken trees, flashes of sunlight. The impact came like thunder. Metal screamed, glass exploded, and the world went black. When Reba opened her eyes, the silence was unbearable. Smoke drifted through the shattered fuselage. Somewhere nearby, a man moaned weakly. She realized she was lying on her side, pinned beneath part of a medical cabinet. Pain shot through her ribs when she tried to move. Blood trickled, stinging her eyes, but instinct overrode pain. "My patients," she gasped, crawling toward the nearest stretcher. One soldier wasn't breathing, another was bleeding heavily from a reopened leg wound. There were no supplies left intact, only scattered bandages and broken instruments. Kneeling in the mud and wreckage, Reba tore strips from her uniform to use as makeshift dressings. She worked by feel and memory, ignoring the ache in her body. Every second mattered. It was then that she heard the sound that froze her blood. Boots crunching on broken glass, voices shouting in German. She looked up to see a squad of Wehrmacht soldiers approaching through the morning mist, rifles leveled at her. For a heartbeat, she thought they would shoot her on sight. She was an American officer, deep behind enemy lines. The soldiers surrounded the wreckage, their grey uniforms ghost-like in the smoke. One of them kicked aside a medical case, peering down at her. Reba's hands didn't stop moving. She kept pressing on a wound, whispering to the unconscious soldier. The German commander, a tall man with a scar down his cheek, barked an order, and to her astonishment, the soldiers hesitated. His eyes fell on the Red Cross insignia on her sleeve. In that tense moment, the rules of war collided with the reality of compassion. Instead of firing, he lowered his weapon and gestured for his men to stand down. Reba stared up at him, breathless, trembling but unyielding. She had no idea that this single decision, this choice of one German officer to see her not as an enemy but as a nurse, would change the course of her life and become one of the most extraordinary stories of mercy in World War II. As the soldiers led her away from the smoking wreck, she glanced back at the twisted remains of her aircraft, the place where her mission had ended, but her true test had just begun. Again, the world was quiet, except for the low murmur of distant voices. Her head throbbed with pain, and the scent of antiseptic mixed with smoke filled the air. She was lying on a stretcher, her hands bound loosely in front of her, guarded by 2 armed soldiers. Outside the window of the makeshift infirmary, she could hear the rumble of trucks and the barked orders of German officers. The crash site was far behind her now. She was deep in enemy territory, a prisoner of war, and yet something told her this captivity would not be like any other. The door opened, and a German officer entered, his uniform immaculate despite the chaos outside. He studied her with the clinical detachment of someone used to giving orders and having them obeyed. When he finally spoke, his English was formal but clear. "Lieutenant Whittle, you will not be harmed, but you are now under German custody." Reba didn't answer. Her throat was dry, her thoughts still fogged from the crash. All she could think about were the men she had tried to save. Were any of them still alive? As if reading her mind, the officer said quietly, "2 of your wounded survived the crash. They are receiving care." Then, after a pause, he added, "Because of you." The words struck her like a sudden light in darkness. In that moment, surrounded by enemies, she realized that even in the heart of war, compassion still flickered, faint but not extinguished. 3 days later, her life changed again. She was transferred to a small military prison, a cold stone building that smelled of iron and mildew. The guards were silent but not cruel. She was given bread, water, and a blanket, though the chill of the walls sank deep into her bones. The silence became unbearable. She replayed the crash in her mind over and over, the smoke, the screams, the sudden impact. She tried to pray but found only exhaustion. Then one morning the door opened. A new officer entered, older, calm, with the insignia of a German, medical command on his sleeve. His boots echoed as he crossed the cell. "Lieutenant Whittle," he began in accented English, "we know who you are. You are a nurse. You are not a combatant. Germany needs medical personnel. You will serve in our hospitals." Reba stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. "You want me to treat German soldiers?" she asked. "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "You will use your American training to save lives. You will be treated as medical personnel, not as a common prisoner." For a long moment she said nothing. Her mind swirled with disbelief, anger, and confusion. How could she, an American officer, heal the very men who had shot her down? Every part of her rebelled against the idea. "I can't," she said finally. "My duty is to my country, to my men. I won't help your army fight them." The officer nodded as if he had expected this. Then he leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Lieutenant, the war is consuming everyone. Our hospitals are full of wounded, not only soldiers but civilians, laborers, even captured Allied men. If you refuse, many will die who need not die. You are a nurse. That is your oath, yes?" His words cut deeper than any weapon. She remembered her training, her teachers, the pledge she had made to heal the sick and wounded, no matter who they were. Could she really let men die simply because they wore the wrong uniform? That night, lying awake on the cold cot, she wrestled with the question until dawn. Duty to country, duty to humanity. Which was stronger? When the sun rose the next morning, her decision was made. She asked the guard for the officer. When he arrived, she stood straight despite the pain in her ribs and met his gaze without fear. "I will serve as a nurse," she said slowly, "but on my terms. I will wear my American uniform. I will be called Lieutenant Whittle. I will follow the ethics of my country's medical code, not yours." The officer's expression didn't change, but he inclined his head. "Accepted," he said. "We are not in a position to refuse help." That was how Reba Whittle, U.S. Army Nurse Corps, became the only American nurse held as a prisoner and assigned to treat German soldiers during World War II. Her first assignment came within days, a military hospital near Aachen, little more than a converted school building filled with the wounded of the Western Front. The halls reeked of blood and disinfectant. The moans of soldiers echoed down the corridors. She hesitated in the doorway, clutching her bag, feeling every eye on her. A German doctor, exhausted and grey-faced, handed her a clipboard. "You start here," he said, pointing toward a row of stretchers. "Septic wounds, 2 already dead." Reba took a breath and forced her shaking hands to move. She worked as she had always worked, cleaning wounds, stopping bleeding, whispering words of comfort. The soldiers looked at her with disbelief. Some refused her touch. Others stared with something close to awe. They had been told Americans were monsters. Yet here she was, saving their lives. That night, when she finally washed the blood from her hands, she looked at her reflection in a cracked mirror. She no longer saw a prisoner or a soldier, only a nurse standing in a place where compassion seemed impossible. But even in that grim hospital, surrounded by the enemy, she found a strange, fragile peace. For the first time since the crash, she slept without nightmares. Outside, the war raged on, but inside the walls of that hospital, something unexpected had begun. A small rebellion, not of bullets or bombs, but of mercy. February 1945. Snow fell over the ruins of Aachen like a silent shroud. The war was closing in from all sides, yet inside a worn-out German hospital, a quiet miracle was unfolding. Lieutenant Reba Whittle, the American flight nurse who had fallen from the skies, moved among the wounded with calm precision. Her presence still caused whispers in the corridors. The American nursed the enemy angel, but the disbelief that had greeted her arrival was beginning to fade. Those who had seen her work no longer questioned her resolve. The hospital was a converted school, its classrooms turned into crowded wards, the smell of ether and rot thick in the air. Broken windows were sealed with cardboard. Heat came only from a single coal stove that never burned bright enough. Reba worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes longer, her breath visible in the freezing rooms as she changed dressings and checked fevers. Her hands were raw from scrubbing with cold water, her uniform threadbare, yet she never slowed. At first, the German staff treated her with suspicion. They avoided her gaze, unsure whether she was an enemy spy or an angelic curiosity sent by fate. But as days turned into weeks, they began to see something they hadn't expected: professionalism without bias. When a young medic fumbled and foreline, she guided his hand without a word. When supplies ran short, she improvised equipment from salvaged metal and cloth. Slowly, the line between prisoner and peer began to blur. One evening, a boy no older than 17 was carried in, his leg shattered by shrapnel. He was pale, shaking, whispering for his mutter. The German surgeon hesitated. There was no anesthesia left, no clean instruments. Without a second thought, Reba took charge. She sterilized what she could, spoke softly to the terrified boy, and held his hand as she worked. He bit his lip to keep from screaming. When it was over, the surgeon looked at her with something close to reverence. "You saved him," he said. She only nodded. That's what nurses do. Word began to spread through the hospital, and soon through the entire medical network. The American nurse didn't choose sides, she saved lives. Her efficiency reduced mortality rates dramatically. She introduced sterile dressing techniques, insisted on hand-washing before procedures, and reorganized patient charts. Within weeks, infection rates dropped sharply. German doctors started to imitate her methods, often in secret, to avoid scrutiny from higher officers who distrusted anything foreign. But with admiration came an undercurrent of unease. Not everyone approved of her defiance of the war's boundaries. Some soldiers spat when they saw her, calling her Feindin, enemy. Others stared at her as though she were an apparition, proof that even in the Third Reich's collapsing world, humanity still existed. Reba learned to block out the stares. She focused on her patients, men whose uniforms mattered less with every passing day. Some thanked her in halting English, some refused to meet her eyes, but all of them lived longer because she was there. One soldier, his lungs torn by shrapnel, whispered weakly, "Why do you help us?" Her answer was simple, "Because you're hurt." That night, sitting on a narrow cot by candlelight, she reread a scrap of paper she had kept since the crash, a page torn from her old mission log. On it she had written a single line before every flight, "Keep them alive." It was the only command that still made sense. In February she was transferred again, this time to Frankfurt. The hospitals closer to the front were collapsing, their wards overflowing with the broken remains of a dying army. She traveled under guard, but was no longer treated like a prisoner. The German medical officer who escorted her carried her bags and offered her food. When she protested, he said, "You save Germans, that makes you valuable." Frankfurt was worse than Aachen, bombed, half-ruined, its hospital halls echoing, cries of men, and the rumble of distant artillery. Reba set to work immediately. She reorganized triage procedures, separated critical from stable patients, and even instructed staff on basic sanitation. Her methods were unorthodox, but they worked. Infection rates dropped, survival rates rose. Her reputation grew until even local commanders knew of the American nurse who brought order to chaos. But fame had its cost. One night, a wounded officer demanded to know if the rumors were true, that she had treated Allied prisoners brought in from the front. When she refused to answer, he sneered, "Then you are no better than a traitor to your country." Reba met his cold stare and replied, "If healing the wounded is treason, then I will bear that title proudly." It was the first time anyone in the ward heard her raise her voice. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the sound of someone quietly weeping in the next bed. Despite the risks, her compassion began to ripple outward. Even a gruff surgeon who once refused to work beside her began leaving her coffee on her desk before morning rounds. Small gestures, quiet revolts against a system built on hatred. Still, the burden grew heavier. At night, when the guns fell silent, Reba sat by the window of her small quarters and looked toward the west. Somewhere beyond the horizon, her own people were fighting forward, step by step. She wondered if they would understand what she had done, if they would forgive her for the lives she had saved in enemy uniforms. Then, one evening, as the last light faded from the sky, a runner burst into the ward shouting that American forces had crossed the Rhine. The wounded men fell silent, listening in dread. Reba felt her heart twist. Liberation was coming, and with it, judgment. But for now, she picked up her medical bag and turned toward another moaning patient. Whatever the world decided later, she knew what she had to do tonight. 1945. The war was reaching its final fever. The thunder of artillery rolled constantly in the distance, shaking the walls of the Frankfurt hospital, where Lieutenant Reba Whittle now worked. Supplies were gone. The wounded overflowed into hallways, and yet she kept going. Her steps steady, her hands sure, her resolve unbroken. Every corridor she walked was lined with German soldiers who whispered about her under their breath, "Die amerikanische Krankenschwester," the American nurse. By then, Reba's name had become something of a legend in the collapsing German medical network. Doctors requested her by name, believing she could bring order and calm to any chaos. Word spread that infection rates dropped wherever she went, that she worked until she fainted, that she could stitch a wound blindfolded. Some said she was proof that Americans were not demons after all, that even the enemy could show mercy. Others muttered that she was a weapon of propaganda, a woman saving German lives so they could fight again. The truth was simpler. She was a nurse trying to hold together what little humanity remained in a world coming apart. Her work became a routine of exhaustion and grace. She would wake before dawn to the sound of air raid sirens, rush through bomb-shattered streets to reach the ward, and spend 12 hours battling fever, blood loss, and despair. She never raised her voice, never allowed herself to hate. Even when the SS officers came to inspect her work, she stood tall, wearing her American uniform, her Red Cross armband still bright against the grey world around her. "I will not take it off," she told one of them firmly. "It reminds me who I am." Among her patients was a young conscript named Otto, barely 18, his leg amputated after a mortar blast. When he first saw her, he turned his face away. "You are my enemy," he muttered weakly. She said nothing and continued dressing his wound. Days later, fever struck him, and in his delirium, he clutched her hand, whispering for his mother. She stayed with him all night, changing compresses, cooling his forehead. When he awoke, she was still there. He looked at her for a long moment and said softly, "If this is what America is like, then I was taught lies." Moments like that became her sustenance. Each patient she saved reminded her that mercy was stronger than orders, that healing could defy flags and uniforms. At the hospital in Munich, her next assignment, the transformation grew even deeper. The city was a ruin, bombed streets, half-collapsed wards, nurses working by candlelight. Yet the staff there, hardened by years of war, welcomed her with quiet respect. They had heard of her efficiency and the calm she brought wherever she worked. Within days, she reorganized the triage system, separating critical cases from hopeless ones, ensuring no bandage or vial of morphine was wasted. Her methods were simple but revolutionary. Patients who would have been left to die now had a chance to live. Soon, something remarkable began to happen. The change wasn't only medical, it was moral. German doctors who had once seen Americans as monsters began to question what they had been told. They watched Reba tend to every soldier the same way, whether SS officer or teenage conscript, and something inside them shifted. "How can she do this for us?" one surgeon whispered to another. "Perhaps she knows something we have forgotten." Even the families of wounded soldiers felt it. Mothers visiting their sons brought her small gifts, a loaf of bread, a candle, sometimes just a whispered "Danke." They saw that she cared not as an American but as a human being. Slowly, the wall of hatred that had defined the war began to crumble, at least within those hospital walls. One afternoon, while checking on patients in the recovery ward, Reba overheard a soldier telling his comrade, "When the war ends, I want to find her country and tell them she is not our enemy." She stopped in her tracks, throat tightening. For months, she had lived surrounded by suspicion and grief. But in that single sentence, she glimpsed the possibility that compassion could survive even here, even in Nazi Germany's dying heart. But not everyone welcomed this change. A Gestapo officer visited one night, demanding to know why an American nurse was allowed to work in military hospitals. The German doctor in charge, who had once been skeptical of Reba, stood his ground. "She has saved more German soldiers than half my staff," he said. "If that is treason, then I too am guilty." The officer left without another word, but the tension lingered for days. Despite the danger, Reba continued her work. Her body was exhausted, her mind haunted by faces she couldn't save, yet she pressed on. She began to see her task as something larger than survival, a quiet rebellion against hatred itself. As the Allied front drew closer, rumors filled the wards. Some said the Americans were already in Nuremberg. Others whispered of surrender. The soldiers watched her carefully, knowing the day of reckoning was near. "When they come," one young man said nervously, "will you tell them you helped us?" She smiled faintly. "The truth doesn't need my defense," she said. In those final days of captivity, Reba realized that she was no longer simply surviving the war. She was rewriting its meaning for everyone who met her. April was only weeks away. Outside the hospital walls, Germany was collapsing, but inside, life still clung on, fragile, flickering, and stubborn. And Reba Whittle, the American nurse who had refused to surrender her humanity, was about to face the moment that would define her legacy forever. April 8, 1945. The city of Munich trembled under the echoes of distant artillery. The war that had consumed the world was nearing its end, and the German hospital where Lieutenant Reba Whittle worked had become a place caught between two realities, one dying, one about to be born. The windows rattled from every explosion in the distance, and the nurses whispered rumors that the Americans were close. Reba said nothing. She simply kept working, her stethoscope around her neck, her uniform still crisp despite the exhaustion etched into her face. That morning began like any other, bandages to change, medicine to ration, lives to save. The wounded were more fearful now, not only of death, but of what awaited them when the enemy, her people, arrived. Some soldiers wept openly. Others clung to the delusion that the Reich would endure. Reba moved among them, calm as ever, her presence the only stable thing in a crumbling world. As the day wore on, the thunder outside grew closer. The ground shook. A young German orderly burst into the ward shouting, "The Americans, they're here!" The words sent waves of panic through the hospital. Some soldiers tried to crawl from their beds, others begged her to hide them, but Reba stood in the center of the chaos, steady as the eye of a storm. "Stay where you are," she said firmly. "No one will harm you here, not while I'm standing." Moments later, the rumble of tanks filled the courtyard. Through the shattered windows, she saw the white stars of the US Army rolling in. A group of soldiers stormed the hospital, weapons raised, scanning for resistance. When they saw her, an American nurse in a German ward, tending to wounded men in enemy uniforms, they froze in disbelief. She turned toward them, her eyes weary but proud. "I'm Lieutenant Reba Whittle, Army Nurse Corps," she said. "Do you have any wounded who need attention?" For a moment no one spoke, then one soldier lowered his rifle, smiling faintly. "Ma'am," he said, "I think you've already been doing our job." The sound that followed was something she would never forget, laughter and relief mingling with tears. The war had not ended yet, but for Reba, that moment was liberation in its purest form. Her freedom, however, came with questions. Within hours, American military intelligence officers arrived to debrief her. They wanted to know everything: where she had been, whom she had spoken to, what she had done. Their tone was cautious, almost suspicious. Had she collaborated? Had she aided the German war effort? Reba sat straight-backed in her chair, answering each question with quiet honesty. "I treated the wounded," she said simply. "That's all." The investigation was exhaustive, but when it ended, so did any doubt about her integrity. Reports from German doctors, soldiers, and even civilians confirmed her story. She had healed everyone she could, shared nothing of military value, and never stopped identifying herself as an American officer. The official report called her actions service beyond the call of duty. She received the Purple Heart for her injuries and the Bronze Star for her extraordinary conduct under captivity. Yet when asked if she considered herself a hero, Reba only smiled and said, "Heroes end wars. I just tried to save lives until someone else did." After the war, she returned home to Illinois. The skies she once flew now seemed far away. She worked quietly in hospitals, preferring the sound of heartbeats and whispered prayers to applause or medals. She married, raised children, and continued nursing well into her later years. She rarely spoke of her captivity, though sometimes, late in the evening, she would take out her old flight badge and run her fingers over the worn metal wings. One day in the 1960s, a letter arrived from Germany. The handwriting was careful, formal. It was from Otto, the young soldier whose life she had saved in Aachen. He wrote that he had become a doctor, inspired, he said, by a nurse who taught him that compassion is not a weakness. "Because of you," he wrote, "I learned that healing is the only victory that matters." Reba never replied, but she kept the letter folded in her Bible for the rest of her life. In her later years, journalists occasionally found her. They wanted her to relive the story, to talk about the crash, the captivity, the moral conflict. She always turned the conversation away from herself. It wasn't about sides, she would say. It was about pain. Everyone bleeds the same color. Reba Whittle passed away in 1981, quietly, in her sleep. At her funeral, a small group of veterans attended, American and German alike. They stood together in silence as her coffin was lowered, the wind rustling the flags above their heads. On her headstone were engraved the words she had spoken on the night she made her impossible choice: "I am a nurse first." Those 4 words became her true legacy. In a war that tried to erase mercy, she had kept it alive. She had crossed enemy lines not with a weapon, but with compassion. Her patients, soldiers, prisoners, civilians, carried her kindness long after the war ended, passing it quietly from generation to generation. And so, when historians debate whether she was a hero, a collaborator, or simply a survivor, the truth remains in the lives she touched. Because every soldier she healed went home with proof that even in humanity's darkest hour, light still flickered, carried by a single nurse who refused to stop caring. Even now, decades later, her story stands as a reminder that war may demand obedience, but conscience demands courage. And sometimes, the bravest act on the battlefield isn't taking a life, it's saving one.